of the biggest controversies in our country right now is whether the American dream is achievable for everyone. Questions of whether future generations will do better or worse than their parents that dominate headlines, social media conversations. But through his work with Policy Impacts and Opportunity Insights, two organizations they co-founded, our next speaker has concerned himself very deeply with those questions. He's going to get us acquainted with the state of intergenerational mobility in the US, as well as some policy solutions that aim to expand it. So please welcome Nathaniel Hendren.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about, is America the land of opportunity? So there's a lot of ways of thinking about defining what we mean by economic opportunity, intergenerational mobility, upward mobility. One way I wanted to start with here is to think about what are the odds you grow up to earn more than your parents did. And in our work, we quantified the statistic for people who grew up in were born in 1940. And about 90% of them grew up to earn more than their parents. But over the subsequent decades, that fraction has fallen to the point where now kids who are growing up, only barely over 50% of them grow up to earn more than their parents. And so what I want to talk about is what do we know about what causes low rates of upward mobility, and what do we think we should do about it? And as a starting point to that question, I want to trace the roots of the outcomes we see today back to the childhood environments in which we grew up. And I want to do this using the Universe of Tax and Census data linked together to help us see variations in intergenerational mobility across the neighborhoods based on where you grew up. So concretely, I want to show you the average incomes of kids who grew up in below median income families, say earning about $27,000 a year, and look at how that varies across the United States. So here in Boston, those kids would grow up to earn about $37,000 per year. If you go over to Dubuque, Iowa, and parts of the Midwest, actually, where I grew up, you can earn more than $40,000, even $45,000 a year on average. If you go down to the South, people on average earn about $26,000 a year in Charlotte, on average, not earning more than their parents. But just enormous variation in the extent to which kids climb up the economic ladder. This becomes even starker when you look at patterns and how they vary by race. This is showing you the average incomes of black men on the left and white men on the right who grew up in families earning $27,000 a year, and showing you how that varies across these different areas. There's not a single area of the United States where black men grow up to earn on average more than white men, even when you restrict to families earning the same amount of money when they're growing up. In addition to differences in upward mobility, we also see enormous differences in downward mobility across race. This is taking white and black men who started in the top fifth of the income distribution. In a sense, their families had made it. And looking at where they fall as adults in the income distribution. About 26% of black men will stay in the top fifth of the income distribution, and 16% fall all the way down to the bottom of the income distribution. In contrast, only 9% of white men fall to the bottom of the income distribution, and 45% of them stay in the top regions of the income distribution. We see variation across broad geographies of the US, but also at very hyper-local areas. This is showing you average incomes across neighborhoods in New York. And what you see is that on average, if you grew up in Harlem or Brooklyn, you're going to grow up to earn about $21,000 a year. But if you just went across the river into parts of New Jersey, you can see yourself earning on average $44,000 a year. So this kind of raises the question, what are the characteristics of places that tend to have high rates of upward mobility? Our work's broadly identified 4 sets of characteristics. Places with lower poverty rates tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Places with stronger family structures tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. So we measure that as the fraction of 2-parent households in an area. If you grow up in a place where there's more 2-parent households, you'll have higher income on average, even if you're in a single-parent household or in a 2-parent household. This is a property of the neighborhood. Places with better schools tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. And places that have stronger measures of social capital tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Now, what is social capital? In our work, we've identified a broad range of different measures of social capital, but the measure of social capital that correlates most strongly with rates of upward mobility in the United States is the extent to which rich and poor kids connect with each other during childhood. This is showing you taking kids who are below median SES and saying what fraction of your friends are above median SES. And what you see is that map looks surprisingly similar to the geographic variation in upward mobility. We can take that same color scale and put upward mobility on the left-hand side and compare that to just the fraction, or the extent to which rich and poor kids connect with each other in childhood. Now, this broad variation in outcomes across place could be driven by sort of one of two very broad factors. On the one hand, you might be sitting there thinking, well, geez, maybe there's just different types of people that live in different places. And we're just looking at this kind of geographic sorting of people to those places. On the other hand, you might imagine that places are actually shaping our outcomes in adulthood. So that if you were randomly assigned to grow up in a different neighborhood, you would have had a different outcome in adulthood. And so in our work, we've tried to answer to what extent is this kind of selection versus causation by studying the experiences of people who move across areas during childhood. And we find that most of this variation in upward mobility actually reflects the causal effects of childhood exposure to these different areas. One way to summarize this pattern is to think back to that map where I showed you on average people who grew up in Harlem earned about $21,000 a year. Imagine somebody who starts there and their family is thinking of moving across the river to Hoboken, New Jersey, where people on average earn $44,000 a year. Our results suggest that on average, if your parents moved when you were 2, you would earn about $33,500 in adulthood. In other words, you pick up about 62% of that gap on average across the United States. If you move later, you pick up less and less of this gap, up to the point of about age 23 where things tend to level off. And so what are we looking at? We are all a product of the childhood exposures, the places that we grew up shaped us in proportion to the exposure time we had in those areas while growing up. This pattern we documented in the United States. Since we originally documented this in the United States, it's now been replicated in a half dozen countries around the world. We're not unique in the United States of being shaped by our economic and social surroundings. And so what I want to turn to now is think about what should we do about this. We know that we've got fairly low rates of upward mobility today, and it's shaped by childhood environments. But what should we do about this? What are the types of policies we should enact to deal with low social mobility or high rates of inequality? The launch point I want to take here is this idea that there's a large literature, largely built on research that has been conducted at MIT to study the causal effects of policy changes. We've got several Nobel Prize winners in SHASS that have won those prizes for telling us what do policies do to people's behavior. But I think it's a little bit more difficult to say, should we do those policies? Why is this difficult? In different domains, we often use different metrics to evaluate whether that policy is a good idea. If we're looking at a health policy, we might talk about how much does it cost to save a life. If we're looking at a jobs policy, we might say how much does it cost to save a job. These different metrics make it difficult to step back and say, where in society should we make investments and where should we raise revenue to do it? And so what we need is a unified metric to evaluate those government policies. And so in this organization policy impacts that you were referencing earlier, we've been using this statistic that we call the marginal value of public funds that is simply calculating for any policy change, what are the benefits that policy provides to recipients relative to the net cost that it has to the government. Where when we think about benefits, we're thinking not just direct benefits of that policy, but also spillover benefits to other people that might benefit. With climate policies that I've been talking with some of you about, it's both the upfront benefits perhaps of a subsidy and the way it might help the environment. From the government perspective, it's not just the upfront spending, but also the long-run spending. So if we have an education policy that increases people's earnings, the net cost to the government is lower when those people grow up to pay tax revenue as adults, and we want to account for that. And so in our work, we looked at 133 policy changes spanning the past 50 years in the United States, policies that are in social insurance and education and job training, taxes and cash transfers, and in-kind transfers. And I'll show you the results that we found, where on the vertical axis you have the marginal value of public funds, the sort of bang for the government buck of those policies. And it turned out to be useful to enumerate these policies according to the average age of the beneficiaries of those policies. We find the highest bangs for the buck for policies that are targeting kids, and lower MVPF for policies targeting adults. What are these types of policies? They're investments in childhood education, healthcare expansions. We've got 4 of the largest Medicaid expansions to low-income kids in that health child bucket that you're looking at in the upper left. College expansion, subsidies, Pell Grants, things that help people get access to college. On average, these policies have the highest returns, and we're actually calling them infinite returns. Why do we call them infinite returns? When the government spends $1 on those policies, on average, when we look at the causal effects of those policies over the long run, the people who are exposed to those policies grow up to pay back not just the upfront cost of that policy in the form of increased tax revenue, but they pay us back a dividend, often exceeding 50 or 80 cents. In contrast, for policies targeting adults, not that these are bad policies, they just don't have this kind of feedback property where you actually get this kind of return. And so what have we learned? Economic opportunity has been fading in the United States over time, and we know that the extent to which we climb the economic ladder is shaped by our childhood experiences. And perhaps as a result of that, historically in the United States, the best investments we have made have been in children. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.